Hello and welcome to the Star Wars Library, where Star Wars is in print. And today we're going to be talking about the next piece in terms of our publication order. Now, last time we talked about the Episode 4 novelization, right? Well, today we're going to be looking at the next thing, and that is, of course, the Marvel Star Wars comic books. These began in 1977, actually in April of 77, so a whole month before Episode 4 came out in theaters. So that's kind of cool, right? So anyways, we're going to look at these today. It is the first, or at least the first 10 issues, I should say, we're going to be looking at. It is actually the first Star Wars comic book series ever, and it ran from 1977 to 1986. And it was a huge hit for Marvel. Aside from being a big Star Wars fan, I'm actually a big Marvel Comics fan. And in doing history of Marvel, a lot of people who worked for Marvel back in 1977 when these books first came out, they have said and gone on record in saying that this series essentially single-handedly saved Marvel from a lot of financial issues. You see, Marvel has always had some financial shortcomings in their history as a company. Of course, now they're doing all right. Being owned by Disney certainly helps, but at the time they were struggling a little bit, and the Star Wars series really helped them out. And of course, Marvel would go on and have some other issues in the 90s, but that's a whole different story. Anyways, so the Marvel comics are a little tricky. And the reason I say that they're tricky is because for a while, probably since about when Lucasfilm in the 90s kind of said, okay, we're really going to make sure that, this content is cohesive and is connected and is all, doesn't contradict one another. The Marvel books were a little tricky because, as we'll see later on as we go through them, there were some contradictions here and there. But of course, a lot of them were retconned and a lot of them were fixed, and we'll get to those when we get to them. But for the longest time, they were considered secondary canon, only until much later being brought into full C canon status. And even then, there were some things where it still was kind of like, is that really C canon? And an example would be in some issues after The Empire Strikes Back, Luke is seen, or is depicted wearing or wielding, I should say, a blue lightsaber. Well, if this is taking place right after Empire Strikes Back, why does he have a blue lightsaber? Why does he have a lightsaber at all? It's kind of things like that where it's a little hard to be like, okay, what's going on here? Especially when you factor in that Shadows of the Empire would then come along in the 90s and establish that Luke got his new lightsaber, or he built it on Tatooine. Again, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but Leland Shee came in and basically said a lot of that kind of stuff can be considered secondary canon. Specifically, he said that the Marvel comics were secondary canon, meaning some of the events happened, but some of them didn't. It was kind of up in the air, kind of back in that secondary canon that we talked about. It wasn't unless a novel or a C canon source depicted or talked about that said comic, in which case then that comic would be C canon. So most of these comic books are definitely C canon. There's a few things here that are still in the secondary canon, but again, we'll get to those when we get to those. So today we're going to go through the first 10 issues of Marvel. And the first 6 issues are actually depicting the fourth movie, Episode 4, the original film. And so this is the run right here. These are the original issues. I think this one, actually, a few of them, except for issue 5, are later printings. I think the issue 5 is the only first print that I have, simply because it has the barcode here. If you look on the others, they don't. And I've done some homework on some of these things and some printings. I've heard, I think the 30-cent issue is a little bit more expensive. Ironically, the cheaper one is the one that's most valuable. But there's a lot of things you can look in online. I'm not really more about of getting, each version of said, printed media. I'm more about just having it in my collection so I can say I have it and I can read it and I can enjoy it and I can celebrate it. So the first 6 issues, this is issue 1, issue 2. The covers are very dramatic. Issue 3. issue 4, issue 5, and last but not least, issue 6, which claims that you will get to see Luke Skywalker fight Darth Vader. Or, yes, battle Darth Vader, which, of course, does not happen. This issue adapts the Battle of Yavin, which the only time Luke and Vader face off are in an X-Wing and in a TIE Fighter, and even then, Vader's chasing Luke. They actually don't face each other. So kind of a misleading cover here. So, just some things to note. I mean, of course, these comics, there's not really much to say about these books. They pretty much just adapt the movie. There really isn't anything. I mean, there's a few deleted scenes in here, but they're pretty much the deleted scenes that we talked about in the episode 4 novelization. There are a few inconsistencies. For example, Darth Vader in this first issue is depicted as green, when he is not. even in the art in the book, if you open it up, Darth Vader is in his typical black suit. Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi have red lightsabers. In fact, that's something that you'll see in all of the early Marvel Star Wars books. I can't remember exactly what issue that they started to get the colors right, but and you'll even see in later issues, they still have the red lightsabers. Now, of course, Empire Strikes Back, I know by then they got that right in that adaptation of the Marvel Star Wars books. But yeah, what are you going to do? Another interesting about this particular issue is that the first issue, Darth Vader, says his famous line, the inability to destroy a planet is insignificant next to the Force. Well, in this one, he calls it the Cosmic Force. Now, of course, that's just a misprint, right? That wasn't obviously what was in the movie, and the movie obviously trumps this in terms of canonicity. But an interesting thing to note is that later on in Dave Filoni's Clone Wars shows, they actually reference the Cosmic Force and actually tie it into the actual Force, or the Living Force, as Qui-Gon Jinn likes to call it. So, in terms of this, I mean, there's some other interesting things in here too. For instance, in issue 2, you get to see Jabba the Hutt as a different alien. I can't remember. He kind of looks like I think it's a weakling or something. He looks kind of like that species. That's not what he is. He's still Jabba the Hutt, but he looks more of a humanoid than he is the Jabba the Hutt that we know and love from Return of the Jedi and all that. So you get to see that. You get to see that original scene here. But again, at the time, we didn't know what Jabba the Hutt was going to look like. Now, George Lucas, I think, always had it in his head that he wanted Jabba to kind of end up how he did in Return of the Jedi. So they had a human actor stand in for Jabba, but of course the technology just wasn't there to get Jabba to do that kind of thing. That's why in Jedi you see him sitting on that slab the entire film, because they were limited by the technology. So that's another interesting thing in here, is you get to see Jabba the Hutt. I think there's actually an explanation in here that they say that that's actually an informant of Jabba. They let a retcon. Again, I'm not too sure about that. I'll have to recheck my source here, but I think I remember reading that somewhere. Anyways, so the Marvel Star Wars, in terms of, the first 6 issues, are they essential? I don't think so. I mean, again, if you're someone who's a huge Star Wars fan and wants to see like vintage Star Wars content, Star Wars back in the 1970s when it was first out, I mean, it's definitely a cool time capsule of what it was like back then. But essentially, though, these are not really essential to your reading. They really are just a recap of the movie. And if you're going to do a recap of the movie, I would encourage you check out the novelization. Anyways, so we're done talking about those. But anyways, now let's get to the actual stuff that I'm actually really excited to talk about, and that is the first true expanded universe content, or a true expanded universe story, and that is in Star Wars issue number 7, right here. This is the continuation of the Star Wars series, and this also explains how Han and Chewie lost their reward money that they got in episode 4, and why in Empire Strikes Back they actually don't have it, and why they have to go pay off Jabba the Hutt. And why it took them so long, or helps explain that. So in this issue, they are basically apprehended by a criminal known as Crimson Jack, and he takes their money, and now Han and Chewie are left trying to figure out what to do next. And of course, this story is also referenced in Timothy Zahn's novel Scoundrels. It basically begins with Han reflecting on losing his money, and he's reflecting on this issue here. Then in issue 8, the Eight Against a World. In this issue, the deadly mission of Luke Skywalker. It also shows a guy who I thinks he's a Jedi. He's not really, but he tries to be. And of course, this also introduces a famous or infamous, depending on what side of the fence you fall on, a certain Jackson, who looks like a giant green rabbit. Jackson would go down as one of the most interesting characters in the expanded universe. Personally, I think he's kind of a cool character. I actually really enjoyed him. I remember even as a kid when I first read this, I was thinking to myself, that's ridiculous. But honestly, it's kind of like a Rocket Raccoon, from Guardians of the Galaxy kind of thing, where you look at him and you're like, oh, it's a rabbit. But how he talks, his dialogue is great. He's written really, really, really well. So I'm in the camp of, I don't mind Jackson. And to be quite honest, he's only in the Marvel books. He really, you don't see him in anything else. I mean, of course, he showed up in Marvel 108, spoilers, but I mean, essentially, he's only in here, and I mean, it's not that big of a deal. Then, of course, we go on into issue number 9, which is right here, and basically Han and Chewie and Jackson are going up against these the Swoop Gang, and the Cloud Raiders, as they're actually called, and going up against them. And last but not least, the Behemoth from Below. Han and Chewie are going up against this behemoth. Now, of course, there is a subplot in these books of Luke Skywalker going on a mission for the Rebel Alliance. It's not just Han Solo and Chewbacca, even though they're the ones who are making the cover. Starting in the next series or episodes we do on Marvel, you'll see Luke on the cover. So Han and Chewie are not the main forefront. We do get to see Luke and Leia as well. So it's a lot of Star Wars characters. Now, what's interesting about this is that they still had essentially a little bit of kind of how they do it, or how they did it later on in the Star Wars Legends timeline, is that essentially they would, Archie Goodwin, who wrote these books, he would have to send his scripts in to Lucasfilm to get approved. And a lot of what they were doing, being focused on Han and Chewie, is because George Lucas still was trying to finalize what he was going to do in, the sequel to Star Wars, which would, of course, be The Empire Strikes Back. So that's why Han and Chewie were really kind of the forefronts here, because remember, Harrison Ford had not signed on to do a sequel to Star Wars. So essentially, Han Solo and Chewie were fair game, conceivably, because the only two actors for sure of the main characters that signed on were Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher. So they're in here, but again, they kind of take a back seat in the first few issues because they're still waiting on George to be like, this is what we're going to do. So it's kind of interesting there. As for the stories, they're okay. They're not horrible. I enjoy them very much, and they're definitely fun stories. But you can definitely tell that these were some of the first EU stories that were printed, and so they kind of play off like that. And again, understandably, some people might be turned off by Jackson the Rabbit. Me, like I said, I don't think so. So when it comes to this, are there any contradictions? No, not really. Again, this is still very early on in the Expanded Universe's life, and a lot of the contradictions, or the few contradictions that did come up, they were a little bit later, and of course they were dealt with. So are these an essential read? Are these an essential part of your Star Wars Expanded Universe collection? It's tricky. Like I said at the beginning of the video, it is tricky. This is the first arc, I guess, or the first beginning set of Expanded Universe stories ever printed, so it is really interesting for that, to know that this is the true first EU story that Star Wars fans got. Was it called the Expanded Universe back then? I don't know. It wasn't. So it is cool for that factor. But as for, are they, essential reads? I don't know. I mean, I definitely think maybe the first arc is definitely interesting. This first run here is pretty good just because it explains why Han suddenly is broke and is now being able to pay Jabba the Hutt back in Episode 5. The Luke subplot isn't really essential at all. That's just more if you want more story. So it's definitely a hard maybe, I would say, to whether you should skip over this or not. Me just liking and being a fan of the Marvel Comics series, I would always say, hey, definitely go pick it up. Is it the first thing I would say go grab? Absolutely not. But if you definitely, want to know what truly happened to Han's reward money and, go back in time a little bit again to the 1970s and see, what Star Wars was like back then, it is truly, again, just like the adaptation to the original film, this is definitely, I think, worth your time if you're into that. Now, again, if you're just looking for a good story, it's up to you, I would say. I think at least these first few issues are essential. But and again, this is coming from someone who really likes the series. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's up to you. So, thank you so much for tuning in. This was a little bit longer than before, but I did have a lot to say about these. We're going to be taking a break in the next episode where we're going to be talking about the first novel that was ever published for Star Wars, and then we will be getting back to the Marvel Comics series. So, thanks for checking this out. Catch you later.